Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and I'm in Toronto, and I'm surrounded by friends who are scattered around Ontario. I see on my screen at the moment Robin Collins, who's in Ottawa. I need somebody. Call Robin. He's always willing. So thank you, Robin. It's always great. Mary Ellen Francoeur is a sister in Toronto, and she's obviously very interested in Pax Christi, as is Rosemary Keenan, who I think is out in Brampton. Rosemary was just telling me that she'd been a student at my college at Arundel College, which is now mostly called University of Toronto at Mississauga, long time ago. And here comes Adam Wynne, who's my right hand. One of the things that I think we might want to start off with is something that Sister Mary Ellen was just mentioning as we were warming up, and that is that she's interested in nonviolence. I've managed to get through this whole morning without being violent to anybody, but mostly because there's nobody in my apartment but me. So,
right. Well, you're certainly there pointing out right away, Meta, that really developing the virtue of nonviolence is not an easy one. And yet I do believe, I trust that it is part of every human being. It is a desire, a deep desire that's built into us. Many years ago now, I was just really drawn to Gandhi and Martin Luther King as exemplars of a lifestyle of nonviolence and putting it into action. Both of them, though, being quite ready to say that this was something they'd have to go on developing their whole lives.
And both of them died by violence.
Yes, exactly. I mean,
that just because you're not violent doesn't mean somebody else isn't.
That's right. So to commit to nonviolence, you are opening, you're making yourself very vulnerable. And so you are in danger because not everybody has chosen that path. So now as a member of Pax Christi, I'm just very grateful that Pax Christi International introduced the whole campaign for nonviolence and has really been working closely with Pope Francis to bring it more to the forefront of Catholic teaching. But through Pope Francis, it's really for the whole world to see it as a path that obviously we so greatly need right now. And I mean, nonviolence isn't only about human conflict, it's also about all of our relations. So it's really about our relationship with the earth as well. And of course, they're all interconnected. So that is definitely my great concern right now, and how to be involved in those campaigns or issues that are really speaking to a nonviolent path. Like, what does it look like in the concrete?
Yeah, okay.
I can come back to that, but I don't want to take a lot of time.
No, I think I'd love for us to really think about that if that's on, if everybody's willing to do that. I'm not going to direct you, but I think it's really a very interesting question of what are the dimensions of nonviolence and some of the dilemmas that you can get into. You know, sometimes if you want to protect a weak victim, the intervention can look like violence, you know, and that kind of thing. You can get into dilemmas where you can't win either way. You've got to do something that isn't very nice, and that conflict is, I think conflict is real. This kind of can lead us into the question, if we wanted to go there, of whether or not people who want to emphasize nonviolence are people who simply don't like conflict and want to make conflict go away or deny it or somehow paper over it. And I think that would be when that happens, I think it's too bad. And frankly, there are peace people, there are peace workers who simply don't like violence and want to pretend everything's nice and happy, even when there are real issues of conflict. So having been provocative, I just threw the cat into the chicken coop. Let's see what happens. Rosemary, you want to respond?
Just to extend on that issue of nonviolence, Indigenous peoples, First Nations in our own country have really brought to the fore how our systems that we've established, whether it's religious or political or social, have created systemic violence, basically, against their own peoples and other vulnerable groups. So I think that's part of the conversation now, is recognizing that a lot of those Eurocentric systems that we have created to protect our communities and to keep our communities peaceful need to be brought into the 21st century. We need to recognize that we are a global community, and we need to, I think, highlight the United Nations more than we do, and recognize that their focus is on diplomacy and peace building and development and social justice. Most of us are very centered on our own community, understandably, or our own country, our own nation, and we are not looking to the larger global community as much as we should. I also wanted to mention 9/11. I think Robin referred to 9/11. I recently watched a movie that's come out. It's called Worth, with the lawyer involved in compensation for victims of 9/11. It's a fascinating dramatization of how that all played out and continues to play out over the years. And that particular law firm went on then to address compensation for victims of other major tragic events in the US. And to extend on that, the Hiroshima Nagasaki Day Committee has been promoting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that has very much a focus on compensating the victims, recognizing the victims. So I think the more that we bring in that human compassion of seeing the victims of violence, the better we learn how to find the solutions that are diplomatic and nonviolent.
Mm-hmm. Good. Robin, you in a way mentioned just before we got started that you wanted to talk about 9/11. What's on your mind?
9/11 and nonviolence. What two items to counterpose to one another.
Mm-hmm.
And Doug Roach had a wonderful op-ed in the Hill Times this week on, he was recollecting September 11th and at the time. He felt that there was a crushing of his hopes to a certain extent, maybe not a crushing, but dissipation of his hopes for a peaceful world and a culture of peace. So I think there's a number of angles on this. One is what leads to the violence, what we can do so that this doesn't happen in the future. There is, as you say, in Meta, always conflict. The conflict doesn't need to lead to violence. It needs to lead to a resolution of the conflict and in a peaceful way. But there's also, what do we do about violent actors, spoilers? And this is a complicated question, especially for peaceniks and that's peace activists and peace advocates. And we have different angles on it. I mean, from the complete pacifists to those who believe that the use of responsive violence in some manner, limited, restricted, legal under the UN, Sometimes it's necessary in order to stop actions that are out of hand. So I'm very interested in that gray zone. You know, peacekeeping is one way of doing it. What are the limits of peacekeeping? You know, the whole just war, is that a valid way of looking at things? So it's very complicated. I'm not a pacifist. I'm a peace advocate. I think there are times when use of force is absolutely mandatory. I usually jump to the Rwanda situation, and I kind of draw it out in sort of the worst language for a peace activist, which is if the only way to have prevented the 800,000 to 1 million people that were killed were to permit and endorse the American military going in and putting a stop to it, would you have? That's how I would phrase it, just to sort of, you know, get the rawest. I would, despite my disgust for what American military does around the world. So, you know, that's one of the complicated questions that we have to ask ourselves.
Well, you know, I think we can even bring it closer to home and just talk about the role of the police, because I, in my life, have called the police 2 or 3 times when you know, I needed help or somebody had broken into my place or something of that kind. And the police are the only people authorized to use violence. And in fact, we know that they get away with using violence indiscriminately and much more liberally than we would want them to. We've now seen during this past summer, or past year, the manifestations of police brutality and killing people and so on, and that they generally get away with it and nobody calls them on it. So clearly there's something difficult and problematic about authorizing anybody to use force on behalf of the society at large. On the other hand, if in a society where there are no police, you almost always see outbreak of even greater violence and more crime and that sort of thing. So, you know, one of the things that Max Weber defined the state as it's the organization that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. We consider that the state has the right to appoint certain people to use violence if need be, to suppress violence on the part of a larger number of people. And in general, I think we would uphold that principle, even when in reality we see it leads to bad things too. So this is just to stir the pot a little bit.
Well, I'd like to speak to that a little bit, Netta. So we could go into a conversation right now about legitimate use of violence and just focusing on violence. But I'd like to come back to the nonviolence, because we know that over the last years, because if we're looking at police, there's been a lot of reaction and pushback to the violence that you mentioned that police have demonstrated in a variety of situations. And so as a result, I think the police forces have really been training their police officers very differently. And they have been teaching them more and more all the options besides the use of a weapon or violence. And so, I mean, I live close to the Danforth, and so it was, is it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was one of the terrible Toronto experiences of a person walking along the Danforth and indiscriminately shooting at people, and did in fact kill one young woman and one very little girl. Now the police came to the scene and pursued this person who was doing this. I'm pretty sure I'm putting these facts together properly. And in fact, he got that person to put down his gun without using violence. And I remember after that, there was so much spoken of. Look at what he did. He non-violently stopped this person who was using violence and actually had killed people. And I mean, then the police chief came forward and said, well, he wasn't doing anything heroic or unusual. He was using the training that all police officers get. So I think that sometimes police officers don't follow through with the training that they've received. But if the public continue to call for the more frequent use of nonviolent means, we might be very surprised at what we actually accomplish and at what help it brings to our society. And also, Rosemary, I think, referred to looking at root causes. We know that violence erupts in the world because there has been some unrest, some sense of conflict, usually because of injustice amongst people. And it's not addressed, or it's certainly not addressed in any effective way. And so, as all such things do, they escalate till it erupts into violence. So one of the very important things we keep learning over and over and over again is to move into areas of conflict or unrest or injustice to address those issues. And I mean, I think that's part of what the United Nations was set up to do, was founded to do. And I really hope that we could keep strengthening the United Nations and putting in place bodies within the UN who could be available for that, who are nonviolent ministers of intervention, not carrying weapons, but going in with a great deal of other skill to address things sooner before they erupt into violence.
I think we do need to make a distinction between acts of violence that are perpetuated by an individual, such as in the attack on the Danforth with the gunman, versus violence that's perpetuated by a state or larger actor like a militia or armed forces and things like that. I'd be curious to hear people's perspectives in a bit more detail on the prevention of violent acts. Now, we just saw last week New Zealand had a mall attack with a mass stabbing, and they're looking to actually outlaw and criminalize attack planning. So is there maybe a way for, and this may be more difficult one way or the other, rather you're looking at it from an individual focus for acts of violence perpetuated by an individual versus that is perpetuated by a group. But how can we prevent these acts of violence in the first place?
I agree. About 10, 20 years ago, organizations began to look at how their employees or members of their organizations were working in silos. And from that has grown a recognition that we need to have communication. For example, in social services, there are a whole lot of different groups providing social services in a community, but they were not necessarily communicating with each other. So I think from that recognition that we need to collaborate with all stakeholders, basically, has grown an emphasis on, for example, police partnering with social services when it's an issue of mental health. And we understand that we will always have a percentage of our community that is suffering mental health issues. So I think there have been good examples of that happening, but the resources need to be put towards that. The money, the personnel, the training need to be put towards allowing the police not to act just alone, but to act in partnership with community organizations and social services. And there, as Sister Mary Ellen mentioned, there's been a huge discussion now on how we need to support communities with the appropriate resources and opportunities for their youth, to address poverty. And these are the kinds of things that will bring us further away from the violent response to injustices.
I would agree with all those comments. I think I would probably start by dividing the domestic from the international problems of conflict. Not that they're unrelated, because they are related, especially poverty, but because the discussions kind of go down different roads. There's the whole police, domestic police, combined with better social service interventions that would prevent police violence or cause de-escalation or enable de-escalation. There's a racism element, but it's not necessarily always the case domestically that the problem is police violence. There's violence and police are responding the right way or the wrong way. I mean, the UN has declared in its charter that war is illegal. So, we have the declarative aspect of that.
When the World Trade Center has been, bombed, hit by planes, what do? I mean, you do something. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who would just say, well, we don't do anything. We just take it.
Okay.
No, nobody's going to just take it. You have to do something. And I remember for some reason, there was a TV crew that I guess they thought I was a peace worker, and so I should have some ideas. And they came, and I remember three people came, and they filmed me asking me questions what I would do that day after the 9/11 thing happened, or the next day. And what I said was, you go talk to those people. Now, I remember the cameraman almost broke his camera. He's so mad at me. He thought that was such an outrageous thing to do. Obviously, what you do when you've been attacked militarily or, with violence is you respond with violence. And from his point of view, that was the only conceivable thing to do. Mm-hmm. And that is why we went into Afghanistan, and even the Iraq thing was just part of it. So, I think the argument that what you want to do is talk to people, even in such a situation, is a hard case to make, but it's kind of the thing to do. I remember there's this lovely woman who was, I can't remember her name because I can't remember anybody's names anymore, but she was working with Christian or peacemakers or something in Central America, someplace where there was a lot of violence. And she was staying in a house full of women. And I can't remember who their enemy was, but some group of young men blew up the front of their house. In the middle of the night, there was a big bomb. And so the women got up and they put on the coffee and they went out to find these guys. And they said, well, come on in and let's talk about it. The front of their house was gone, but they wanted to talk to these guys. And I gather they had a conversation. Now, I don't know how many people would propose that, but if you're not going to propose that, what else would you propose? When we all remember 9/11 for sure, what did we think should happen apart from what we thought was going to happen? What did we think should be done in response?
Well, I went back in time and looked up something. I posted it recently, what I had written in October. And so I had done a survey of peace groups. And in fact, Doug Roach is one of the people I had in my piece, and what he had commented on. Some of it he had put in the op-ed that's in the Hill Times this week. But the vast majority of peace activists and peace organizations argued for a police response, whatever that means. But it was not a military war response. So if you were, let's just take 9/11. Let's forget about the Nazis for the moment.
Okay.
Let's just take a case of a dozen whatever young mostly Saudi Arabian men who come under the auspices of Al-Qaeda to the U.S. to cause havoc. And so they commit suicides in this action. They're no longer around to bring to justice. So you look at the people who inspired them, or the people who paid them off, or whatever. And is this a war, or is this a criminal activity that requires international police action? At the time, there were a lot of people who said this was a police action requiring a police response, an international police response. No question that the United Nations Security Council would have supported a police action to chase down those who were running the show, Osama bin Laden and others, who were in Afghanistan. And the Taliban, who was in charge in Afghanistan, had said at the time, yes, if you ask us, you can come in and get these folks. Right. So that conversation we often don't have anymore. It's assumed that the Taliban, evildoers that they are, should not be talked to. And the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are the same synonymous phenomenon. And so knocking over the Taliban is the equivalent of knocking over Al-Qaeda. So I would make a point here, and this is not to undermine the point about nonviolent responses to individuals where that's possible, but I would make a distinction between talking to those you can talk to, and putting down those people who are committing atrocities at the moment. Sometimes you really do have to do something like that. Now, the Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan could have been brought in front of an international court. And, if it was the ICC, they would get life imprisonment. There are political questions here as to whether the United States would have permitted that, particularly considering the domestic emotions that were in play and the pressure on the American government. But it could have been done. There's a very good documentary on Netflix right now. No, it was following the 9/11 event.
Oh, okay.
Beginning in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that inspired Al-Qaeda, and so I just sort of, it was from 1979 to 1921. How much of this can be laid at the feet of the major powers? They didn't start with American actions abroad that Al-Qaeda felt needed the dropping of the two towers plus. It began with the Soviet invasion, animosity against invasions by many in the Middle East, including extremists in Afghanistan, harbored by the Taliban. So it's a wider picture of why what happened. Beginning with, they could have begun from the Cold War. It could have been from the end of the Second World War. How did that link to the two towers coming down? But they started with the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. So it's very interesting. It's called the turning point.
Which really points, Robin, to how valuable it can be to go back and trace the beginnings of unrest. And I suppose if you lived in Afghanistan at that time, naturally, you would not have been happy with Russia invading. And so it builds and builds. Mm-hmm. So, and then finally we deal with this huge crisis moment. But it really is important to go back and say, where in the world did all this begin? It didn't just happen all of a sudden. And so as a world, and I realize I'm perhaps not speaking to, okay, so when you're in the crisis, so what do you do? I guess I'm also speaking to, what are we learning as a human race? Are we learning anything? Or do we want to learn that everything has a history? And can we learn to identify or just to recognize when there's an injustice going on? Now, we could also go back, and I mean, I don't know enough about history and politics to know what led to Russia invading Afghanistan. So there's a whole history there. I mean, on and on it goes. When do we stop and say, this is insane? I mean, what are we about as a human race? Do we have the right to just go into different countries as we desire, to do what we want with the people who are there? Can we overthrow governments? What are we learning? I mean, we've had a long history of possible learning, but I guess there isn't really a willingness because of all kinds of dynamics, inner dynamics. So when you talk about a culture of peace or a culture of nonviolence, we're really talking about a long-term evolution of humanity learning and developing about what is it we really want. It was very interesting. I mean, I'm changing, but it's all connected. On Sunday, I was at the air show here in Toronto, which happens every year. And so there were a number of us peace folks there to protest and to be giving out information about the fighter jets that were being promoted. In fact, people were being given free caps of the F-35, which Canada is right now sort of planning to buy 88 new planes from that company, or those particular planes from Lockheed Martin. So people were just there to see the air show, and we're going around saying, do you know what these planes are? Do you know what they represent? Well, I ended up having this really fantastic conversation with a couple from Israel. And so it was such a good example. And I learned a lot from saying to them, are you aware of these planes? And because I was not coming across in a loud kind of dominant way, we were able to have a conversation and they felt I was ready to listen. So they talked from their perspective of what it was like to be an Israeli. Feeling, the invasions, feeling imminent danger at any point, and the incredible need to protect oneself. And so they could see the need for arms and planes and whatnot, because, as he said in a very down-to-earth way, if you're going out for a picnic and you don't know what's going to happen. It may not rain, but it may rain. So you're going to take along what you need for the rain. But he was using that as an analogy to say, life is kind of like that. You never know what's going to drop upon you. And so you need to have the protection for whatever may happen. So putting myself in the place of an Israeli, I could appreciate that. And so I met them there at that place. And then, he and his wife were able to reach the point of saying, but, in the end, we don't want lots of weapons and we really don't want war. And I said, well, we're really on the same page, aren't we? And so how can we together figure out, this is what we desire. How do we get there? What are the steps to getting there? I said, for us, we're figuring that maybe it's helpful for us to be here and say, I don't think it's helpful to have fighter jets, that rain down bombs on innocent people. And this couple happened to have a little baby. So we talked about the future of this little child, the future of children. That changes conversations. Again, as a human race, where are we going? What do we want? Do we want more and more children killed, maimed? That's what weapons have done. So it is complex, there's no doubt about it, but how do we move in the direction of a world where we don't keep resorting to more and more and more weapons and seeing them, as NATO does, as the prevention of further violence?
Mhm. Absolutely.
That's the security question, right? And some people hear the word security and they think militarism, but security has a much broader meaning. And when we talk about nuclear weapons and the obscenity of their use, or even pondering their use, even in possession, here's where Pope Francis has made a significant contribution by commenting on the problem of possession of nuclear weapons. Forget about use or threat of use. Possession implies an intention ultimately to use, right? It's a very important point that he made. But if you look at the fact that nuclear weapon states have nuclear weapons that haven't been used since 1945, they have them because somebody in the package of national security or even international security has postulated that holding these weapons, never intending to use them, that's how it's phrased, to prevent others from using them against us, makes us feel secure, right? That's nuclear deterrence, but it's a huge problem to address if you want to get rid of nuclear weapons. So from my point of view, you cannot do it without coming up with an alternative security system that is absent nuclear weapons. And it includes many of the things that you, Mary Ellen, and all of us have talked about in terms of alleviation of poverty, conflict resolution, United Nations legal mechanisms in place, international courts. Like there's a systems approach that is mandatory if we're to displace the current forms of security with new forms of security. It's not like the new forms are new in the sense that we haven't talked about them before, but we seem to be back on our heels all the time. We have to sort of appeal to people. When you speak of nonviolence, it sounds like you're ignoring what everybody knows is out there threatening us, but what you're actually talking about is these other forms of security that can displace the problematic forms.
Yes, of course, I agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so important what you're saying, and it applies to every form of weaponry and violence. If we keep seeing that as the only way to be secure, in fact, what I keep talking about humanity, that's really a demeaning of our human potential. Humanity is far more creative than that. And I really feel so sad that humanity doesn't keep choosing to use all of its creativity and keeps falling back on this one way.
Yeah.
Which is only destructive, not only to person's lives, but it's destructive to the human spirit.
Yeah. Imagine, here's a counterfactual. Imagine if after 9/11, the world community, the UN, the US leadership had done the right thing. Imagine how different our world would be.
Exactly. Yeah.
If this had been turned into a police action, there are criminals out there who had committed activities that the world abhorred, There were some still alive. Let's go get them. We have Interpol. We have. Let's not turn this into a war which brings in Iraq, which had nothing to do with that, with the 9/11 events anyway. And how different the world would be right now if we knew. Not only did we not have all those wars, all those trillions, all those hundreds of thousands of people killed since 2001, but we would have the knowledge that other ways could have been used to bring justice.
Exactly.
Yeah. I wonder though, doesn't that presuppose something else? That there is a rule of law, that there is some kind of global governance such that somebody can say for sure what is an act of a crime, an international crime, and some authorized body exists with the mandate to go get the wrongdoer.
Yeah. Well, here, Meta, let's just take the two. Let's take Afghanistan and Iraq. The Americans determined that the Taliban and Afghanistan deserved war because they harbored Al-Qaeda and the terrorists. So Iraq did go to the Security Council, and the Security Council determined that war was not allowed. So the Americans went in anyway in violation of the United Nations. In terms of Afghanistan, the Americans went in and after the fact were justified by the United Nations Security Council. That could have been challenged further and said this, a police action was possible. The Taliban has been willing to give up Osama bin Laden. There's no need to take the Taliban down. So that war wasn't necessary. So the mechanisms were there. They weren't fully put into place. And part of that was the politics of what had happened and showing solidarity with the Americans, right?
And it was pretty widespread solidarity, you have to admit. Everybody in the world thought, well, the U.S. has been wronged and we better help them.
But what should we do is the question.
Yes, there really wasn't that, I'd love to think that there had been a debate along the lines that you suggested, Robin. But honestly, what you posed just now, may have been the first time I ever heard anybody suggest it. I don't remember hearing that conversation.
There was some debate, and in fact, Canada was one of those who made very, very strong comments that this is not a war. How much worse it would have been if the terrorists had weapons of mass destruction. The Canadian ambassador to the UN at the time, Heimbecker, I think it was, had some very strong comments. Chrétien had some good comments. It wasn't impossible, but it's true. The Americans said, we're going in, show solidarity. I mean, showing solidarity with the Americans doesn't mean you have to take down another country who harbored criminals when they offered to give them up.
Well, by the same token, let me bring it up to date. Right now, the balance of opinion is, I think, in the US and I believe globally, that Biden has botched it, that he should not have taken out the American troops so rapidly and decisively and without regard to the protection of all the people who had helped the Americans. So there's a lot of talk about how we have abandoned millions, or at least hundreds of thousands, of Afghans who had been our allies and to whom we'd made promises. We being, this applies to Canada and especially, of course, to the US. The argument is that and decent, nice people, really, some people say we should have stayed and fought, just not fought so vigorously and sort of gradually withdrawn. But given the fact that the Taliban were certain to take over and reimpose the kinds of abuses that we think they're going to reimpose against women and against their former enemies, that it is an immoral act to have stopped the war. That I would say, if you ask public opinion, if you did a poll, and there probably are polls, that most people would be more likely to take that position than, let's say, Michael Moore's position, which is, Biden did the right thing, even if there's some costs involved. Anybody?
Meta, I had a chance to listen. Oftentimes I'll put on Al Jazeera news because it gives you a little bit more of a global view. And I had a chance to listen to Biden's address to the nation, explaining why he withdrew from Afghanistan. And in that context, you can see that it was in the works even before he became president. And also, he mentioned a couple of things I found very interesting. One was, of course, you've heard the term forever war. We've got to stop this forever war. It should have been stopped 10 years ago. And the other was, we've got to stop, as a nation, the US, going in and remaking other countries. And the fact that boots on the ground in terms of military personnel is not the way going forward. It was a little bit scary because he talked about drone attacks and, of course, surveillance and security systems that we have in place instead of boots on the ground now. But to me, it was kind of hopeful in that he's recognizing there's no point in going ahead with these kinds of violent wars at all. So I want to read that through again. And the second thing I want to mention is, it's my birthday tomorrow. And my husband just got me a copy of Mark Carney's Values, which I'm really looking forward to reading, because he's someone that I think we can all recognize has expertise, both in Canada and globally. And he's promoting changing our systems and looking at how we include everyone and build a more of a global community.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Happy birthday.
Yes, indeed. Happy birthday.
Well, yes, and I would wish for your
Happy
birthday, I would wish for your birthday, Rosemary, that the world would really choose different values and a whole different vision.
Rosemary brought up the notion that, of course, we've got to stop trying to remake other countries. And I'm really ambivalent about that. I think, for one thing, it's pretty arrogant to assume that we have the perfect system of governance, and that, no one wants to claim that any one country has reached the promised land. But I do think that I have some sense of responsibility for people who are victims in other countries, and that for me not to try to influence decision making in another country just because it's a different country. I can't accept that. I really think I live in one world, and we see that the decisions that are made in one country inevitably have terrible effects in others. I mean, we can talk about the U.S. and its military aggression, but we can talk about other cases, such as, for example, the burning of the rainforest in Brazil. Now, that this is something that's going to ruin the whole world. It's threatening all of us, and none of us can say we should be indifferent to it. So clearly I'm opposed to whatever government is in Brazil that's trying to do that, and I will do everything I can reasonably to support the people who are trying to make some changes and get that kind of thing changed. Well, I have the same feeling. I have always had the same feeling about people in totalitarian governments or authoritarian governments that are repressing people. That of course there are people that I want to do everything I can to help, and that may mean doing a lot to try to encourage a change in the system of governance that may prevail, whether it's right now in Hong Kong or the Uyghurs in China, or I have lots of friends in Russia who are horrified by things that are going on there. And we could go on. Clearly the world has some really bad governments, including maybe our own from time to time, but I can't be indifferent and say, I can say I'm not going to go to war against these countries, but I'm not going to say I don't want to try to help change them.
There's the distinction, the important distinction that you made, Meta, wanting to influence and going to war.
Invasion.
Biden said one other very interesting thing. If this were to be the Biden doctrine, I would welcome it. He also said that the time for the U.S. to cause or influence regime change with military force is over. That was in the same speech, Rosemary, that you heard. I believe that was the phrase he used. It was briefly in the newspapers, and I haven't seen it since.
Mm-hmm.
But what an interesting thing to have said. Now, having said that, I think one can still argue, or agree with those who argue, that on day one there's American military, and on day two they've all left, and the Taliban is in power, and Afghanistan will have to deal with the consequences. There doesn't have to be a black and white. There can be a phase out, a fast phase out. There could be UN peacekeepers brought in to help. That doesn't mean that what the Taliban has in mind is going to be something that we would support, ever. That doesn't mean that we have the right to prevent the Taliban from carrying out their in particular, their activity against women. That doesn't mean that we should cease our opposition to what they're doing. So it is complicated. I mean, I tend to agree with Meta and many others that we do have a responsibility to protect citizens in states that are oppressive, but what you do is limited. I mean, ideally, just even on the Taliban question, there are some signs that this Taliban may not be the Taliban of the late 1990s. Then again, we don't know, and so maybe they will be more moderate. In the Afghanistan people are the ones that have to determine what their government will be. It shouldn't be through major powers. One of the reasons why the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is mentioned as the beginning of the Twin Towers is because the Americans were supporting the opposition groups within Afghanistan against the Soviets regime, a Soviet-backed regime, and this led to groups like the Taliban coming into power, and then Al Qaeda subsequently. Those are the at what point could none of this have happened? What's the scenario that we re-roll the tape in which Afghanistan is neither Taliban run nor as Soviet run through whatever? We can't answer these questions, but we're faced with that with that problem now, which is what will happen in Afghanistan when foreign troops exit.
You know, I wonder if I kind of think it's maybe possible we almost have an agreement on this. I don't know. Mary Ellen, can you and Rosemary tolerate what Robin has said? Because I think I can even for once agree with Robin. I don't know. What about you?
Well, I mean, just the one piece that I would offer, I certainly agree that the world can certainly be active in paying attention to what is happening to other persons in the world, particularly where there is oppression and just grave injustice, inequality, etc. But that we really need to be very, very careful about how we express that, how do we live that out. And I'm very troubled with how nation states come up with scenarios of why they feel it's necessary to go into a country and bring about change for these people. Let's face it. I mean, I think a lot of us looking or listening to these scenarios can be quite suspect. What is the motivation? If it were pure motivation for the lives of people who are oppressed, that's one thing. But usually there are all kinds of ulterior motives. And maybe, you know, being human, there's always some of that. But I mean, let's be honest about it. Really be upfront. What is my bias? What's my baggage? What is my true motivation? So, I mean, apart from Afghanistan, we've also got South America and Venezuela, countries figuring they've got to put out the person governing Venezuela. Well, excuse us, there are others who are saying, I don't think you've got it straight. Even people in Venezuela are saying that. So I think we just have to be extremely careful. And that's why I would really hope that the powers of the UN could be strengthened. So it's not a state like the United States deciding this is their mission, but rather it's a world discussion and how together will we express our grave concerns and be supportive in quiet ways of the local organizations that are working for peace, particularly women's organizations.
Fair enough. I mean, I think we've got as close to an agreement as we're going to, right? And it's pretty good. I'm encouraged by the almost consensus and maybe real consensus that we've achieved today. So you see, we didn't know what we were going to talk about at the beginning, but it all worked out. Thank you all. It's been fun, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meta.
Rosemary and Robin.
It's been a great
Nice to
conversation.
meet you all.
Bye.